In the early 19th century, America faced a turning point that few talk about today. When the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in 1808, the ships stopped coming, but the system that depended on human labor did not end. Instead, a new, darker chapter began within the country itself. Plantations in the South still demanded workers, and the economy still thrived on the backs of the enslaved. But without the constant importation of people from across the ocean, plantation owners turned inward for a solution, one that would forever stain the nation's conscience. Across Virginia, Maryland, and beyond, a quiet, calculated system took shape. Enslaved men and women were not only seen as laborers, they were turned into instruments of expansion. Every birth became a transaction, every family a potential source of profit. The cruel logic was simple: if new people could no longer be brought from Africa, they would be created here, within the borders of the United States. This system was not written into the law, but it lived in the practice, in the records, and in the cold language of trade ledgers and advertisements. The human cost was immeasurable. Families were torn apart, love was controlled, and lives were dictated by those who saw people not as individuals, but as numbers on a balance sheet. It was a quiet form of horror, one that did not happen in the shadows, but in plain sight, supported by greed and justified by the twisted beliefs of the time. Yet, from within this system, humanity endured. People found ways to love, to hope, and to hold on to their dignity even when everything around them was built to erase it. Their strength, their resilience, and their will to survive are the real stories history often forgets to tell. This is a story not just about the past, but about understanding how far humanity can fall, and how powerful the will to rise again can be. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard and remembered, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep history alive, the parts that shaped us, and the lessons we must never forget. When the ships stopped arriving, a silence fell across the docks. The waves that once carried thousands across the Atlantic no longer brought new lives to the shores of America. The year was 1808, a year that changed everything. The transatlantic slave trade was officially over. But for those who profited from human labor, the end of one trade was merely the beginning of another. Plantation owners looked out over their vast fields of cotton, tobacco, and sugar, and they saw a problem. Their profits depended on hands, strong, tireless hands to plant, to harvest, to build. Without the constant influx of new people from across the ocean, they feared their empire might begin to crumble. But greed is a powerful teacher. Where compassion could have ended suffering, calculation instead found a way to continue it. In the quiet corners of plantations, a new system emerged, one that didn't rely on ships or harbors, but on the bodies of those already trapped within the institution. It was an unspoken policy, never officially written but deeply understood: the future of the labor force would now be born on American soil. Across states like Virginia and Maryland, patterns began to form. Younger women were suddenly more valuable, not for their strength in the fields, but for the potential of the children they could bring into the world. Each birth meant another set of hands, another generation bound to a life they did not choose. Families became statistics, children became assets before they could even speak. Records from the time reveal the cold arithmetic behind the system. A person was worth more if they were of childbearing age. Men with certain physical traits were described in ledgers as prime, chosen to produce stronger offspring. It was commerce disguised as necessity, cruelty masked as practicality. And though few spoke of it aloud, everyone involved knew the truth: this was the business of survival for the enslavers, and the destruction of humanity for the enslaved. Behind the numbers, though, were real lives. A young woman staring at the horizon, wondering if her child would grow up beside her or be taken away. A man forced into roles that stripped him of choice, dignity, and love. Generations of people lived under the shadow of a system that reduced the most sacred act of life, bringing a child into the world, into a transaction. And yet, through all of this, there were moments of resistance, quiet acts of defiance that history rarely records. Mothers who whispered hope into their children's ears. Fathers who taught their sons and daughters courage in a world designed to break them. Even in the face of unspeakable injustice, there was still humanity, unyielding, burning, and alive. The end of the transatlantic trade did not end slavery, it transformed it. It moved from the ports to the plantations, from ships to the very homes of those held in bondage. It was a shift from capture to control, from importation to generation. It ensured that the system would sustain itself for decades longer, feeding off its own victims. This chapter of history is often overlooked, buried under larger stories of war and politics. But to understand the full story, we must see it clearly, the moment when an empire built on oppression refused to end, and instead found new ways to survive. These stories matter because they remind us that even when humanity was turned into economics, there were still hearts that beat, dreams that endured, and people who refused to be defined by the chains they wore. In the decades after the transatlantic trade came to an end, two states rose to an unexpected kind of prominence, Virginia and Maryland. Once known for their own plantations and proud colonial histories, they gradually took on a new and haunting role. They became the suppliers, the sources from which the Deep South drew its labor. The fertile lands of the Chesapeake were no longer just fields of tobacco, they became the cradle of a human trade that would feed the hunger of an expanding empire. In Virginia, families who had lived under bondage for generations began to notice a change. The cotton boom in the Deep South was transforming the American economy. Vast plantations in states like Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama demanded more and more workers to clear fields, plant crops, and harvest under a relentless sun. The need seemed endless, and where demand rose, Virginia and Maryland answered, not with ships or imports, but with people already born within their borders. Plantations in these upper South states grew quieter, not because they were empty, but because they were turning into breeding grounds for a system that never rested. Men, women, and children were gathered, counted, and sold in organized markets that stretched from Richmond to Baltimore. Traders moved in and out of towns like ghostly merchants, their ledgers filled with numbers, ages, and prices, cold statistics that concealed an ocean of heartbreak. It was an industry built on calculation. Older plantations that no longer needed as many workers discovered that their surplus could be sold to the booming Deep South. Virginia and Maryland, once the heart of America's early agricultural wealth, now profited from exporting people. The journey southward, known as the Second Middle Passage, became one of the largest forced migrations in U.S. history. Thousands walked in chained lines, traveling hundreds of miles toward a future they could not escape. Behind each transaction was a story. A mother holding her child a little tighter the night before an auction. A young man forced to say goodbye to everyone he had ever known. The sound of footsteps fading down dusty roads while families stood helpless, watching pieces of their lives disappear into the horizon. The traders who organized these sales built fortunes. Cities like Alexandria and Richmond became hubs of the trade, their warehouses filled with people awaiting transport. The language used in advertisements stripped away humanity, words like hands, prime, sound, and breeding age replaced names and identities. Every sale carried with it the echo of something lost, community, love, and the fragile hope of belonging. In Maryland, the story was no different. Once a borderland between North and South, it became a key corridor in the trade. From its ports and markets, people were shipped down rivers and roads, bound for the cotton frontiers that stretched across the Mississippi Valley. Even as the nation grew richer from its exports, it was the bodies and labor of the enslaved that made it possible. For those who lived through it, the trauma left invisible scars that lasted generations. The forced separation of families created wounds that no freedom could fully heal. Oral histories and letters from the decades that followed speak of names forgotten, of siblings never seen again, of songs that carried memories of home long after it was gone. Virginia and Maryland's landscapes still hold traces of that time, quiet fields, old auction blocks, and forgotten paths that once echoed with the sound of chains. They remind us that history's power lies not only in what was built, but in what was taken. In the end, these two states became symbols of a system's persistence, not through conquest or war, but through the cold efficiency of trade. They supplied the lifeblood of an empire that thrived on control, turning life itself into currency. In the quiet corners of plantations across the American South, an unspoken truth lingered, one that few dared to record, yet it shaped the lives of countless women. They were not seen as daughters, wives, or mothers, but as instruments of a cruel arithmetic. Their ability to give life became a currency, a resource to be measured, controlled, and exploited. These women carried the weight of a system that viewed their very existence through the lens of profit. Each dawn began the same way, the hum of the fields awakening, the call of overseers echoing through the mist. But behind those daily routines, a deeper injustice thrived. Women of childbearing age lived under a constant shadow. They knew their worth was not defined by their character, but by their capacity to bear children who would, in turn, be bound to the same fate. To the ones in power, every birth meant more labor, more wealth, and more endurance for a system built on human suffering. The stories that have survived, those told in whispers, letters, and memoirs, reveal how these women fought to hold on to their dignity. Some resisted quietly, shielding their emotions from those who sought to control them. Others found courage in small acts of defiance, in secret gatherings, in whispered prayers, in moments when they reminded one another that they were still human, still capable of love, still connected to something greater than the walls that confined them. There were times when they were told who they would live with, who they would marry, and when they would become mothers. These decisions were not their own. Their lives were mapped out by others, driven by greed disguised as order. Records from plantations and personal diaries speak of pairings arranged not for affection, but for productivity. It was a cold, systematic process, reducing life's most sacred act into a transaction. Yet even in the face of such control, the women found ways to endure. They sang songs that carried coded messages of hope. They told stories to their children that spoke of lands beyond the horizon, of freedom that felt like a dream but never faded entirely. Their resilience became their quiet rebellion. Some tried to protect their children from the same fate, doing everything they could to keep their families together. But in a world where love was seen as a weakness and connection as an obstacle to profit, families were often torn apart. Mothers watched their sons and daughters taken away, powerless to stop it, yet they carried their memory in every heartbeat. Historians have found countless documents where traders described women by age, strength, and the number of children they had, or could have. The language was chilling in its detachment. It stripped away names and stories, reducing people to statistics. But behind those cold words were real women who laughed, dreamed, and wept, who longed for normalcy in a world that denied them that right. Some of the women whose stories survived later became storytellers themselves, turning memory into testimony. They spoke not only of pain but of perseverance, of how they managed to hold on to pieces of themselves even when everything else was taken. Today, their legacy remains not just in the history books, but in the strength of their descendants. The women once defined by others' control left behind a quiet power, one that reminds us that humanity can endure even in its darkest hours. Their strength was not born of choice but of necessity, and in their endurance lies one of the most profound truths of history, that even when the world seeks to break the human spirit, it can never fully extinguish it. In the world of slavery, even the birth of a child, a moment that should have symbolized hope, was transformed into something deeply tragic. For the mothers who lived under bondage, each new life came with both joy and heartbreak. The first cry of a newborn was often met not with celebration, but with silence. Because from that moment, the child did not belong to its mother. By the cruel logic of the time, the child belonged to someone else entirely, the person who claimed ownership over the mother herself. This law, simple yet devastating, ensured that the cycle of bondage continued unbroken. It meant that every birth increased the wealth of the person in power. The laughter of infants, the gentle cooing of babies, all of it was counted not as a family's blessing, but as a master's profit. In ledgers and account books, these children appeared as numbers, their names replaced with notations like, boy, born May, or girl, born September. Each new entry marked another life absorbed into a system designed to keep generations in chains. For the mothers, this reality shaped everything. The moment they felt the first stirrings of life within them, they carried a weight that no words could describe. They knew that no matter how fiercely they loved, that love could not protect their child from what awaited. Some prayed quietly, asking for strength to raise their children in a world that offered them no safety. Others whispered lullabies filled with hidden meanings, songs of endurance, of faith, of a hope they dared not speak aloud. Plantation records reveal how birth was treated as an economic event. Midwives, often enslaved women themselves, were called upon to help deliver babies in small cabins lit by flickering candles. These women brought life into the world with trembling hands, knowing that what they delivered was not freedom, but another life bound by circumstance. They were the silent witnesses to a system that measured the value of human life in coins and harvests. In some regions, plantation owners tracked fertility rates with the same precision as crop yields. They calculated how many children could be expected from each woman over time, turning the most intimate aspects of life into business projections. The more children born, the more workers to tend the fields, the more profit to be made. Births that should have united families instead deepened their pain. And yet, even in such a world, the bond between mother and child could not be erased. Many mothers risked punishment to hold their babies longer, to sing to them just a few minutes more before being sent back to work. They found strength in those fleeting moments, the only time they could be simply mothers, not workers or property. Some mothers made unimaginable choices to protect their children. They hid them when traders came to inspect the young, prayed for illness to keep buyers away, or pleaded with overseers to spare them from separation. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, was a declaration of love in defiance of cruelty. For the children, life began under the shadow of ownership. They grew up surrounded by a reality that told them they were not free, that their lives were already spoken for. But within the community of the enslaved, they also found something powerful: care, storytelling, and wisdom passed down from those who refused to let despair have the final word. Elders told them of a world beyond the fields, of ancestors who once lived freely, of dreams that could not be chained. Every generation carried those dreams forward, often quietly, but with unshakable strength. The birth of a child might have added to someone's wealth on paper, but it also brought another spark of resilience into a world that tried to extinguish it. In that contradiction, between ownership and love, profit and hope, lies one of the most haunting truths of history. Even when every system was built to claim their children, the mothers never stopped believing that someday, those children, or their children's children, would live and breathe in freedom. There was no sound more painful than the cry of a family being separated. It often began quietly, whispers of an upcoming auction, rumors that a trader was coming down the road. But soon, the truth became impossible to ignore. The market day had arrived, and with it came the end of countless families' shared lives. On those mornings, the air hung heavy with fear. Mothers clung to their children, refusing to let go until they were forced to. Fathers stood helpless, their faces hard but their eyes filled with sorrow. No one knew who would be taken, who would be left behind, or whether they would ever see one another again. What had once been a home, a small cabin, a corner of earth where laughter had echoed, could be emptied in a single afternoon. To the people who arranged the sales, it was business. To those who lived it, it was heartbreak beyond words. Traders and buyers moved among the crowd, inspecting people as if they were goods. Children were often the first to be chosen, their small hands pulled away from their mother's grasp, their tears met with silence. Some were too young to understand what was happening. Others were old enough to realize that the goodbye they said that day might be forever. In many places, this tearing apart of families was not the exception but the rule. It was seen as a practical measure, a way to prevent the bonds of love and loyalty from becoming stronger than the control of ownership. Those in charge believed that by keeping families apart, they could break spirits, erase hope, and ensure obedience. But what they underestimated was the endurance of memory, how love, even when divided by miles and years, could still find ways to survive. Letters and whispered stories passed through the underground networks of the enslaved, carrying fragments of news, a son now working in another state, a daughter who had grown tall, a husband still alive somewhere beyond the river. These small messages, carried in secret, became lifelines. They reminded people that they still belonged to one another, even when the world tried to convince them otherwise. There were also moments of courage in the face of despair. Some families tried to flee together, risking everything to avoid separation. Others made secret promises before being torn apart, vows to find each other again someday, no matter how far they were taken. Many never succeeded, but those promises became part of a collective spirit that refused to die. Even within the harshest conditions, people built new forms of family. They took in children who had lost their parents, calling them son or daughter, not by blood but by love. Communities rebuilt themselves again and again, proving that even in the absence of freedom, humanity could not be erased. Still, the pain lingered across generations. Stories of separation were told and retold, of a mother who never stopped searching, of a father who kept a small token of his family hidden beneath his shirt, of siblings who recognized each other years later by the sound of a familiar song. These stories were both wounds and reminders, proof of what had been lost, but also of what refused to be forgotten. For those who lived through it, the world was divided into two parts, before and after the separation. The laughter of a child, the warmth of a shared meal, the simple comfort of family, these became memories to carry through long nights. And yet, in those memories, there was something powerful, a truth that love, once formed, could not be completely broken. Generations later, their descendants would tell these stories with reverence. They would speak of strength that outlasted cruelty, of love that traveled through time. What was once an attempt to erase connection instead became a legacy of endurance, a reminder that even when families were torn apart, the spirit that bound them together could never be sold, never silenced, and never truly lost. In the faded pages of 19th-century newspapers, among notices for land and livestock, there were other listings, ones that revealed a darker side of the nation's history. These advertisements didn't just sell goods or crops, they sold people. And buried within the columns, in plain sight, were words that showed how deeply cruelty had been woven into the language of business. Among these phrases appeared one that was both chilling and ordinary to those who read it then: breeding women. To the readers of the time, it was a familiar term. To us now, it is a window into a world where humanity was stripped away and replaced by cold calculation. These notices were printed without shame, using the same typeface as any other sale. They listed ages, physical descriptions, and qualities that measured people not by their character but by what they could produce. The words were blunt, transactional, and devastating in their simplicity. For the traders and buyers, such advertisements were part of the everyday rhythm of commerce. A woman's worth was often assessed not by her skills or her spirit, but by how many children she might bear. The system had turned one of the most natural parts of life into a business strategy, and these public notices were its ledgers. Each ad represented not just a transaction, but an entire system built on exploitation disguised as routine. Historians later uncovered these records in dusty archives, realizing that the very documents used to conduct business had become evidence of a brutal truth. On the surface, the language seemed ordinary, strong, healthy, likely to increase stock, but between the lines lay the weight of human suffering. Every phrase spoke to the normalization of exploitation, a reminder of how society can grow accustomed to injustice when it is wrapped in the language of economy and law. Imagine a passerby in a small southern town, standing at the corner store or post office, glancing at a newspaper pinned to a wooden board. He might scan the announcements, his eyes catching on those words, not with shock, but with acceptance. For him, it was part of the world he knew. But for those whose lives were being described on that page, it was a record of their captivity, written by someone who would never know their names, their dreams, or their pain. Behind every advertisement, there was a story, a woman who had once been part of a family, a community, a world of her own. She might have remembered the songs her mother sang, or the scent of the fields at dusk. Yet in those records, she existed only as a line of text, a property valued for her ability to create more property. Her humanity was reduced to statistics, her future sold before it began. Over time, the repetition of such language shaped public perception. When something appears often enough in newspapers, posters, and auction sheets, it begins to seem normal. And so, a society that prided itself on progress and faith became one where the exploitation of others was not hidden but advertised. The cruelty was not whispered in secret rooms, it was printed for everyone to see. Still, the truth outlived the ink. Those advertisements, meant only for commerce, became a lasting testimony. They showed how words can reveal the moral blindness of an age. Today, they serve as proof, not just of what was done, but of how easily people can accept the unacceptable when profit and power demand it. The paper has yellowed, the ink has faded, but the meaning remains clear. Each line stands as a record of lives commodified and voices silenced. Yet by surviving, these documents also bear witness to the resilience of those they sought to erase. For every name that was never written down, there was a life that mattered, a story that endured, one that no advertisement could truly contain. In the quiet hours of night, when the fields were finally still and the air hung heavy with exhaustion, there were men who carried a burden few could imagine. They were strong, capable, and unbroken in spirit, yet they were chosen for something that stripped them of their dignity in ways that left invisible scars. These men were forced into roles they did not choose, reduced to instruments in a system that saw their strength not as a sign of humanity, but as a tool for profit. They were selected for their youth, their health, and their build. Overseers and traders would measure their bodies with the same calculating gaze used for livestock, judging who might produce the most children. In this cruel design, they were not husbands or fathers in the way nature intended, they were made to fulfill a role that denied the very essence of love and family. Their connections, their emotions, their longing for stability, all were dismissed as irrelevant to the goals of those in power. For some, it began without warning. A man might be summoned from his quarters one evening, told to follow, not knowing what awaited him. Orders were given, and he was expected to comply. Refusal was not an option. Resistance meant punishment, not only for him but sometimes for those he cared about. In that moment, choice vanished. What remained was a deep conflict between the body that obeyed and the soul that recoiled. The cruel irony was that these men were often admired for their strength by the same people who denied them their humanity. They were praised as good stock, yet treated as less than human. The system twisted natural relationships into transactions, leaving behind a trail of emotional ruin. A man could be forced to father children he would never be allowed to raise, his role ending the moment the child was born. His name, if recorded at all, was merely a detail, a footnote in someone else's ledger. In the quarters, whispers of these acts spread quietly. Other men avoided eye contact, not out of judgment but out of sorrow. They understood too well the cruelty of being used in such a way. Some of these men, burdened with guilt they did not deserve, carried the weight of knowing that the children who shared their blood would grow up in the same system that had trapped them. It was a cycle that devoured generations, built upon a manipulation of the most personal parts of human life. For the women involved, it was another layer of suffering, and for the men, another layer of shame. Bonds that might have formed under different circumstances were instead tainted by coercion. Families that might have been born of love were instead divided before they even began. The men were denied the right to choose whom they loved, whom they built a life with, whom they protected. The system took not only their labor, but their sense of self. And yet, within this darkness, traces of humanity endured. Some men, against all odds, tried to maintain connections with the women and children they were tied to. They offered small acts of kindness, a piece of food saved, a whispered word of comfort, a moment of shared silence that said, "I see you, I remember you." Those gestures, though fleeting, were acts of resistance, reminders that they were still human in a world determined to deny it. Years later, when freedom finally came, many of these men searched for the families they had never been allowed to know. Some succeeded. Most did not. But their search itself was a testament, proof that despite everything, love had survived the unthinkable. In the records of history, their names are rare, their stories often untold. But behind every ledger and statistic, there were men who carried both strength and sorrow, who lived through what no one should endure, and who, in the quiet corners of their hearts, never stopped longing for the families they were forbidden to have. Centuries have passed since the days when human lives were bought and sold, yet the echoes of that time still ripple through generations. The past does not simply fade because time moves forward, it lingers in the stories passed down at dinner tables, in the unspoken pain carried in families, and in the ways people navigate identity, belonging, and resilience today. What began as a system built on control left behind something far deeper, a wound that stretched across time. For those who lived through it, the trauma was not just physical, it was psychological, spiritual, and generational. To survive, many learned to hide their emotions, to shield their children from hope that might be too dangerous to hold. They taught silence as protection, endurance as strength. Love became an act of defiance, and memory a form of resistance. But beneath that strength, there was pain, the kind that never fully healed because the world offered no space to grieve what had been lost. When freedom finally came, it did not erase what had been endured. People stepped into a new world carrying the invisible weight of generations of dehumanization. Families tried to rebuild, but how could they, when the foundation itself had been shattered? The trauma was passed down not through blood, but through the ways people learned to survive, the guardedness, the mistrust, the quiet fear that stability could be taken away at any moment. Even in the decades that followed, the echoes continued. Communities were told to move forward, yet the structures around them still bore the fingerprints of the past. The exploitation had done more than take lives, it had rewritten how people saw themselves, how they were seen by others. It replaced humanity with false narratives that persisted long after the chains were gone. Psychologists now call this intergenerational trauma, but for those who live with its effects, it is something much more personal. It is the way a parent teaches their child to be careful in a world that might not see them as equal. It is the ache of a grandmother who remembers the stories her ancestors whispered but could never write down. It is the resilience that grows from pain, the determination to turn suffering into strength. Art, music, and storytelling became the vessels for healing, the ways to reclaim what had been taken. Through song and word, people began to rebuild their sense of identity, to remind the world and themselves that they were never the things history tried to make them. Each generation added its voice to that ongoing story, transforming inherited pain into a form of power. Still, the remnants of that old system can be felt in subtle ways, in disparities that trace their roots to centuries-old injustices, in stereotypes born from the lies that once justified exploitation. The past may not be visible in the same way it once was, but it lives in the background, shaping lives and choices in ways many never fully see. And yet, within that legacy of pain lies something remarkable: survival. The descendants of those who endured the unendurable have carried forward not just memories of suffering, but an unbreakable will to live, to rise, to reclaim their humanity fully and proudly. They have built culture, community, and creativity from the ashes of cruelty. They have taken what was meant to destroy and turned it into a story of endurance that the world cannot forget. The trauma remains, yes, a scar left by history's violence. But scars are not signs of defeat, they are evidence of survival. They remind us that even in the face of dehumanization, the human spirit refused to disappear. And so, the echoes of that past continue not only as a reminder of what was done, but as proof of what could never be taken away: the strength, the dignity, and the unyielding humanity of a people who endured, remembered, and continue to rise. The story of slave breeding is not just a chapter in history, it is a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of a nation's past. It shows how human lives were woven into the fabric of an economy built on exploitation, and how the pursuit of profit blurred the line between morality and survival. Beneath the grand ideals of liberty and progress, there existed a system that measured worth in bodies and futures in numbers. It was not only a story of cruelty, but of how that cruelty became ordinary, accepted, and even justified in the name of prosperity. In plantations across the South, the economic machine of slavery depended on human reproduction as much as on human labor. The very foundations of American wealth, the cotton industry, the sugar fields, the ports, and the banks, were all linked to the forced expansion of a population that never chose its fate. Each child born into bondage became part of a chain that strengthened the nation's economy while deepening the moral debt it carried. The wealth that fueled cities, industries, and institutions did not come from innovation alone, it was extracted from the lives and bodies of those who were denied their freedom. Yet, within that same history lies another truth, the unyielding resilience of those who endured it. They were more than the roles forced upon them. They built families in impossible conditions, created music that carried memory and hope, and passed down wisdom in stories whispered under the stars. They dreamed of freedom long before it came, and when it did, their descendants carried that dream forward, transforming pain into progress and silence into song. Today, the legacy of this history still lingers, not only in records and documents, but in the structure of society itself. It reminds us that the story of America is not just one of freedom and opportunity, but also of contradiction, of ideals built alongside injustice. To understand where the nation stands now, one must look honestly at where it began. Only by facing that truth can we begin to heal the distance between what was promised and what was endured. The story of slave breeding is not merely about suffering, it is about endurance, about people who refuse to be defined by the cruelty around them. It is a story that asks us to remember, not to dwell in guilt, but to honor the strength it took to survive and the courage it takes to tell the truth. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening, for learning, and for remembering. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe, so that more people can understand the history that shaped us all. And as the night settles in, may you rest with a deeper appreciation for the strength of the human spirit. Good night.